of it and pop it up here, that would help too. I think I might do that too. All right, if you have your book, we're going to be looking.
Mine since you got yours until we order some more.
Okay. All right, now,
I can use his at home.
we went through, does anybody remember what we did last week?
We talked about the waters and
The land mass.
the geography.
We had, we had, a geography lesson where we're seeing the Holy Land and the different areas, you know, pretty much for the whole, where everything's at, Old Testament, New Testament, and it's all in the size of the state of Texas. And that's what's
very enlightening.
yeah, I think a lot, it caught me too. I was like, wow, you know, it's kind of odd to see that all the biblical areas, and a lot of it was around Capernaum, and then you had the Jordan River, and what was right below that,
Dead Sea.
Dead Sea.
Yeah, that is.
And the Dead
Tommy
Sea.
brought up that Sodom and Gomorrah, it's been on my mind.
Yeah, I think it's possible, but I mean, because Abraham wasn't too far from there, and those different lands. I've heard it somewhere else before, but I'm not going to quote that or anything. But the Dead Sea has so much mineral content that nothing can grow in it, and then it doesn't drain out. It's actually the lowest place. It's actually the lowest place on Earth. It's not the lowest place in the oceans, because we know the Mariana Trench is like what, so many miles down, and different things like that. But it's kind of interesting. That's a very interesting place that nothing can grow in it, nothing can survive it, and maybe that's why some people do speculate on the Sodom and Gomorrah with the fire and brimstone and destruction, and who was it? Lot's wife turned and looked back. She turned to a pillar of salt. That's one of the heavy minerals. It's a high salt content in that Dead Sea. It's so high. Well, the oceans have salt content, right? You can taste it. I mean, it'll make you sick if you drink it. But this area is just so high that nothing can grow in it. And along with some other minerals that what we see here. Now today, we're going to be looking at the historical books is what we're looking at today. And you go to page 29, and you'll also look, it's got a timeline of U.S. history right at the bottom there. And this is how they're going to try to help us to see the timeline of the Old Testament a little bit. And you go to page 30, and right there on page 30, you have the key era. It's like the era is like a section of time. Then you have a key figure, which would be a person that everybody could remember, right? And then the location and the storyline. Now, on the key area it's talking about the United States, colonial, key figure, Ben Franklin. Does everybody remember Ben Franklin? $100 bill. That's what most people remember it for. What about he supposedly invented, the electricity? Location was Boston. So they kind of give you this, say, well, hey, when you look at a colonial timeline, you kind of pick certain benchmarks or certain points, and they're going to do the same thing with the Old Testament. Now, like we kind of touched on it with the geography. When you think about Moses, you think about what? You think about Egypt, right? You think about different people, and it kind of brings you to that one spot, and that's kind of how I'm seeing it too. All right, now, right below that chart right there on 30, it says the same approach can be used in condensing the story of the Bible, charting the main periods or eras, the central figures, main locations, into a storyline. And that's what he's doing here in the next 9 pieces. So the main 9 the eras, the ERA, it's not like the baseball era. That's kind of different, right? Isn't it? I know I'm not a baseball person.
Yeah, it is.
That's when you make a mistake, though.
Right.
This isn't like that. This era is, like you said, it's like a big section of time. It could be 100 years, 200 years, but it's like that one big event and the one person that just jogs your memory. So it's a helpful tool to know these. Now, the creation is the first main era, right? We see that in Genesis, and we see that, it's a big piece of time. We're not really sure, on the years until you get into the people. The people, like where it says so-and-so lived and died and had these kids. That helps us to put that timeline together, and that's why you hear a lot of people that have done those studies, they say, well, we know according to this that the earth is 6,000 plus or minus so many years. And then you've got, well, hey, some people say, well, hey, God's been around forever, and there's all these other universes, and it's like, well, yeah, but according to what we see here, we're looking at a timeline like this. When we go back to written languages, we can go all the way back to Abraham today, which was 4,000 something years ago. When you get back further than that, it gets kind of fuzzy on the written languages and all that. Why is that? Well, you had a big massive flood around Noah's day, and then after that it kind of started over, right? But we see that the author, who's the author of the first 5 books of the Bible? Moses, right? Yeah, and you say, well, he wasn't there at creation. That's something that's like, no, well, he went, God gave him this information, jotted it down. He was there for the entire Exodus. And remember the other books right after that, Deuteronomy, and what's the other ones? Joshua, Judges, in the first 5. Numbers, Leviticus, that's the law, right? We see a lot of things happening with Moses, and it's like it gets them kicked off, and they get into the promised land. It's a whole big thing. But creation, this is where everything started. Then you see the patriarchs. Look at number 2. And the patriarchs are like your big people that are the benchmark people. Like Abraham would be a patriarch. Okay, so let's look at that. It says the birth of the Hebrew people through a family covering a 200-year period. So we see Abraham as that patriarch in that one. Now look at look at Exodus number 3. Exodus of the Hebrew people as they are delivered out of the 400 years of slavery in Egypt. So you see that's a big time frame, right? We're at the top of page 31 there. Then you see number 4, the conquest. Now, what was the big character in that one? Anybody? Joshua, yeah. Joshua also had what we call a cohort at the very beginning of the Exodus, and there was 2 of them. It was Joshua, and there was somebody else that went into the land to spy out the land. Anybody remember that? Caleb. Now, what was interesting about Caleb? Anybody remember?
86 years old and went to war.
Went to war, 80-something, 86.
And took on the giants.
And took on the toughest ones of the area. He was like, that was the toughest area, had the giants in it. And him and his crew him and his tribe went up there and whooped them all. And they said, y'all need to go out of here.
That's how he got rid of his daughter.
That's all you gotta do?
He promised the men there that whoever took a certain portion of that land, he'd let them have his daughter for marriage.
Oh yeah, I think I remember that. Yeah.
That's one way to get rid of it.
Yeah. She must have been pretty. She must have been real pretty.
That's the reason the Lord did not let me be born during that time.
Yeah. But what kind of
I'm
guy?
not telling you a story, it's a fact.
So he was 86. So during the 40 years in the desert, right when that got going, he was 46. And him and Joshua went into that land, and they said, man, we can take them. With God's help, we can take them. But the other 10 leaders of the tribe, they're like, man, they make us look like little grasshoppers. They're the giants. And they were scared, and man, that started off the whole 40 years right there. But Joshua and Caleb made it through the whole time. And Joshua winds up being the leader of all Israel, right? And he goes in to conquer all these different areas. And there were some ups and downs and different things like that. But that's in the conquest portion of it. Promised land by the Hebrew people, it says the conquest of the promised land by the Hebrew people. Upon their return from Egypt. So you see the big arrow right there. That's a big chunk of time right there. Then you go into the judges. Now, what was the purpose of the judges?
To judge the people.
All right. What else? Anything? Nothing.
Help,
Like they were suffering for a while, and the people would be praying out to God. God would send them a judge. The judge would go out, and he would help them to take back what was theirs, or to defend the people. And then you'd see a whole bunch of different things like that. One of the ones, they were rulers, and they were called judges. So you could kind of look at them like, anybody know what a theocracy is? Like, we live in a democracy, but a theocracy is what?
Three.
My God, it's
Yeah,
ruled
three.
by God.
It's ruled by God and God's people. Like, so the judges were actually the rulers of the time. There wasn't kings yet.
There's supposed to be spiritual guidance as well.
Right.
Deborah was one, that was always a big thing, you know, Deborah was a judge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
She was the only female judge.
Yeah, that was the only one, yeah. But, you know, that was an interesting story there, too. But what's one of the ones that just jumps off at the page? Does anybody remember one of the famous judges? He didn't do so hot. He was super strong. Huh?
oh,
Samson?
Samson.
Yeah, that's it. He killed, like, was it either 600 or 1,000 Philistines with a jawbone? He didn't have an M16 or machine gun. He had a jawbone, and just was killing these people. Man, that was the enemy. The Philistines was the enemy. He had superhuman strength that was provided to him by God. And what was the one thing that would take his strength away?
Cutting his hair.
Yeah, when they cut his hair, that was it. And that goes back to that Nazarite vow. All the way back to before he was even born, they told him he was not going to get his hair cut, he's not going to drink wine, there were certain things on the Nazarite vow that you had to do. He didn't do none of that. He disregarded that when it went the way he wanted to, and got in all kinds of trouble. But even in his death, he tried to make things right with God.
It was a man that cut his hair.
That,
You think?
that was the last, that was like the straw that broke the camel's back. He had broken all the others.
Broken all of them, yeah.
Yeah, then. but
He
that-
wasn't supposed to be going with them kind of women, but that's the ones he wanted. Want what you can't have, and that's exactly what he done. Mom and Daddy tried to tell him.
Actually, he wasn't supposed to have any women.
Oh, he wasn't? Oh, okay.
It was Nazarite vow.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, with that, yeah. But see, he was tough though, but even in his death, he was trying, it's like he would turn back to God, he'd try to do right, but then he'd mess up again. But right there at the end, he had killed more people in his death than the whole time, all these other things. That was kind of interesting. So that's real interesting. Now, then you get to the kingdom era. Now, why they call it the kingdom era? Anybody?
Because they had to have a ruler, a king.
Yeah, this is where the king started. The first king was Saul, and he was, the people wanted him. He stood head and shoulder above everybody, and they liked him. But the second king is the most famous one, David, right? Why was he so famous? Anybody?
God chose him.
Yeah, God chose him.
He's a man after God's own heart.
Yeah, when we go read the Psalms and we read different things about him. But one of the things that people remember in Sunday school is David and Goliath, right? He killed this giant with a rock and a sling. But then he also mentions that before that he killed a lion and a bear. So, David wasn't no little, pipsqueak. He knew how to use that rock and that sling. Some of his mighty men were so good with the rock and sling that they could cut a hair in half with that rock. Like they could sling it, hit a hair. That's like some of them Clampetts would be shooting matchsticks from 500 yards away. The Beverly Hillbillies, anybody remember that?
Yeah.
they'd be shooting them match heads and lighting them, and he said, well, I can do one better than that, and he shot 2 of them because he made it ricochet off the wall. Yeah, that's, y'all probably don't remember that, do you? Beverly Hillbilly.
Oh, I
No.
do. I still watch them.
Planets.
Yeah, you gotta introduce her to that.
Yeah.
Uh,
Oh my goodness. I feel ashamed as a parent.
You gotta know when you pour the whole box of cereal in a bowl and you eat the whole bowl, that's a Jethro bowl of cereal. That's a Jethro bowl, okay.
Okay, we're going home to watch the Beverly
Like a big old,
Hills.
like
I'm
a,
sorry.
a big old turkey, like a 20-pound turkey would be on there. And he'd walk down, sit down, and like 5 seconds later, you turn around and he's finishing off that last bone. It was so dumb. All right, let me get back to it. We have the kingdom area. It's a 400-year period where Israel is a full-fledged nation ruled by this monarchy. This is where you get into, they walked away from the way God was doing it. Then they kind of said, we want a king because we want to be like everybody else. And God relented and gave him a king. But David was the one that was after God's heart. David is man, he was great in a lot of ways, but he made mistakes just like everybody else. Made some serious mistakes. All right, then we see the exile. Now this is a 70-year period where Israel leaders live in exile. That's where we got into last week about Babylonia and what was the other one? I got it back here. You got let's see, Persia, Syria. That's one I was thinking of. And you have this, they're in exile. Then one of the famous ones in that was Daniel. We know Daniel in the lion's den. We remember that story. But there was a lot more to it than that with Daniel. A lot of prophetic writings on that about the end times. Then we see the return. And now the return, I was reading ahead a little bit, and we have, they mentioned Ezra. And I kind of lean more toward the main character being Nehemiah. But they're right in that same group there. Nehemiah was like the leader to get that wall built back. And there was a lot of struggle with that, with him and the people and the surrounding enemy, I guess you say. They didn't want them to build it, so they tried to, throw everything at them that they could to be an obstacle. But they did get that. Now, then we see the silence. Now, this is an odd thing right here, but we see that there's a final 400-year period between the close of the Old Testament and the New Testament. So it's kind of funny. You got a 200, Exodus 400, Judges 400, Kingdom 400, Exile 70. Then you see the return, silence 400. That's kind of odd to see that. It might not be exactly that many, because I think the silence era was like I'm not going to quote it, but I wanted to say it was like 430 right in there. It's more like 430. And what makes that so interesting, because the prophecies about Jesus, hit right on the money about him being the Messiah coming to Bethlehem.
So who broke the silence?
Who broke the silence? Yeah, John the Baptist.
Oh, God did.
Okay.
Yeah.
He's always got the trick question ready, locked and ready. I knew I was gonna get in trouble.
No, it's John the Baptist.
Yeah, John. Yeah, he was the forerunner. Yeah. What? Did you have something, Tammy? You was holding your finger like that.
Oh, no. Oh.
All right. So we finish up page 31. I go to page 32, and you see this kind of like an arc. Okay. Now this helped me to remember these, and we're focused on the Old Testament for tonight, and we'll get into chapter 4. We'll get into the other. This is just another way that we can remember the structure of the Old Testament. So number 1. What's number 1?
Creation.
Creation. Number 2.
Patriarch.
All right.
Egypt.
Number 3.
Egypt.
Exodus, right?
Yeah, Exodus.
All right.
Conquest.
I'm sorry.
And then you got number 4. You see the little swords crossed like that? Conquest. Number 5, Judges, right? Then you got the Kings. exile, and the return, and then you see number 9 is that silence. So now go to page 33. You can reread that, but the 400-year thing kind of jumped out the way they brought that out. I'm not all into the numbers, but it's kind of neat to see that. Another place you see there's a lot of places there's different numbers. You got, and I don't want to get into that too much, but as far as genealogies, you can go, I think it's Matthew, the very first, well, no, it's one of the guys, but I can't think of it right off here. It mentions 14 generations from this to this, and 14 generations this to this, and it's just right on the money. And we see those generations. It's all by design, is how God's doing these things. It's like everywhere you see something like that, it's interesting, but God did it for a reason so that you can see a signature right off of it. That's why I see it. It's like, who else would do something like that, or why would it come out to be like that? Because there's no coincidence. He's got it in an order. So we see that in a lot of different things that God's done. There's an order to it. Who here has done physics and physics too? You know physics and stuff? So how many feet per second is like when you drop something, and no matter where you're at, how fast does it fall?
Real fast.
Real fast. It's 32 feet per second, then each second it doubles, doop, 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 and it gets faster until you hit a certain rate. It happens like that every time you drop something. Now the only thing that makes it go slower is wind resistance. Okay, so if I'm falling like this with my arms and hands out, I'll bounce off the ground doing about 90. But if I'm doing like this, I'm gonna hit about 120, right? Because of wind resistance. But you're only gonna fall that fast until you max out at like certain speed. So anyway, you know that if you're in a vacuum, drop a feather in a bowling ball, it'll hit at the same time, right? You ever seen that video? You seen that one? Lord, if you're in a vacuum. If you're in a vacuum, that no wind resistance. So boom, that's a gravitational thing. You see, when you are a Christian and you go into it looking at it from God's standpoint and from the design standpoint that He's done this, it all makes total sense. Okay? All right, anyway, that was just a side note. Page 33 at the bottom, let's kind of look at that. 9 central eras, 9 central figures. All right, so try not to look at it. We kind of discuss it. Who's the main character in creation? Adam, right? First man. We have the patriarch, the first patriarch, the one who was the very first Hebrew, the very first person of the Jewish nation. He had been promised, who was that? Abraham, right? We see the Exodus. He's also the author of the first 5 books of the Bible. Moses, right? All right, now the conquest. Joshua, remember that? Leader of Israel's army. Judges. Samson. All right, everybody remembers him. And the kingdom. Kingdom heir is David. Then we see an exile. That's why I mentioned Daniel a little bit. He was the prophet that was all through that time frame. I want to say it was Nebuchadnezzar. Was it I'm thinking Belshazzar, and then I'm not sure about that. Well, then you had 2 others. I think he went through 4 kings, if I'm not mistaken. But I don't quote me on that. I'd have to go back and study it myself. But he was an old dude, right? All right. When he got through all that, exile, we see Daniel, return, Ezra, which you could put a slash and say Nehemiah right there too.
Ezra was the first one that went back.
He started it, and then Nehemiah come back, kind of picked up the baton.
Ezra was more like a governor type, and also, I mean, he was a spiritual leader in it, but.
Yeah, so we see Ezra, the central return leader, then the silence. Now they've got the Pharisees right down here. Now it is true the Pharisees were on the scene, and there was that period. So it's like, well, how are they the main characters of that silence? Well, They still had the sacrificial system going. They had the Pharisees, and somewhere in there, they got off track. Because when Jesus comes on the scene, they're part of the ones that want to kill him, right? You had the Sadducees, the Pharisees, but now not all of them wanted to kill him, because we see in the Gospel of John, chapter 3, Nicodemus comes to him at night and tries to figure out what's going on. There were some of them that saw what he was doing and understood who he was. So that's kind of interesting there too. All right, now you got page 34, you got a review, and then you go to 35 and you talk about those locations. Let's take a quick look. We talked about geography last time, but you see here on page 35, you see the main location was Eden. The patriarch era was Canaan, but now you also see off to the right, he was from the land of Ur near Eden to Canaan, where he and other patriarchs lived until the time Egypt. Okay, who was that? You had Abraham, the son was Isaac, and then you had the third, the kind of like the daddy, granddaddy, or grandson. No, daddy, son, grandson. I'll get it right in a second. Who was the grandson? Jacob.
That's the three patriarchs.
The three, right? So you see Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and you'll see that mentioned in a few places. But the crazy thing about Jacob, his name meant what? You know? Trickster.
Yeah,
That's right, trickster. Now he was Jacob, went through all kinds of stuff, and just years and years and years of working for Laban. I hadn't studied this, I'm going from memory, so I might get something wrong. But he spends all this time trying to get this beautiful girl. What was her name? Rebecca? Leah was the ugly one.
Oh, yeah, Rebecca.
Oh, 14 years. He worked 7.
7 and another 7.
He got Leah, then he had to work another 7.
Yeah, he had to work a long time for this girl. But then on the way back, God changes his name. And what did he change it to?
Israel.
Israel, yeah. And Israel, also known as Jacob, ends up having, with both these girls, there ended up being 2 of them, ends up having 12 kids altogether. Sons, yeah. Has the 12, that's the 12 tribes of Israel. That's a bunch of kids, isn't it? But then you have, you got these there's certain ones, there's one that jumps off and we see Judah. Judah is where we see that bloodline where Jesus, because he was from the tribe of the line of Judah, right? And we see, man, it just kind of opens up from there where we see all this coming from this family that God, he pulled this guy out, Abraham. He says, you're going to be my guy. And then he messes up. Man, everybody's messing up through the whole thing, but God turns it around and tries to help them back, get them back on track all the time. Even today, he tries to do the same thing with us. Now, we see Exodus, and notice he says 400 years right there on that number 2. Well, no, it's not there, but it was close to that. I think it said it in a couple pages before. Patriarch 200 years is what they're saying. I thought it was 400.
It's 400.
I thought it was
A third paragraph down about Egypt and
now it was because when Joseph, he's the one with the coat of many colors, right? He goes in, he ends up being the second in command of the whole everything, right? Everything. And they wind up getting the land of Goshen, which was the best of the best in that area. 400 years later is when they become, or they are, the slaves of Egypt. And then we see just terrible things happen. And then we see the 10 plagues. And then finally Pharaoh just says, man, get them out of here, right? And they wind up overtaken without even having a battle. They overtake the Egyptians hand them gold and whatever they can handle, and they, what do they call it when they, the spoils of war? They took everything, just about everything, on the way out, didn't even have to fire a shot. That's how God took them out. That's pretty interesting. All right, now, then you see after the time in the desert, you got the Egypt. We see that they migrated that way, and we see the conquest time with Joshua leads into the promised land Canaan. Then we see Samson after that. You got that next 400 years, and you see the kingdom. If you keep seeing this, you'll be like, oh yeah, I got it now. I see how you do it. All right, so then you got on page 36, you got Daniel, and this is where it gets kind of fuzzy for me when I get into this era, because there's so much going on, and then you get into, there's a lot of prophecies in there too. And it's like, well, how does this meet up with this over here? You're trying to make it fit, but this will help right here. Then you see the return, Nehemiah, Ezra, Jerusalem, the Israelites, they were exiled, but they returned. Jerusalem rebuilt the city and the temple, though they remain under the dominion of Persia. Now, there's a couple kings there, but there was it Cyrus? Trying to think of the name of the king. He went by Cyrus, and there was another one. I ain't gonna say for sure on that. Darius.
The last.
But who was the one that gave him the letter to go rebuild the wall? Darius was. I thought it was. I don't know.
But you may be right, because
The Cyrus.
because he used those two names. One side is like a Greek name, and the other's
That's what I was thinking.
a
He had.
name. So
They went by both names or something. It's kind of fuzzy, but then you have the Silence era. They had the land changes from Persia to Greece to Rome. Rome was the actual nation that controlled things at the time of Jesus coming on the scene, right? We see the Roman Empire at that time. But they're allowed to worship in Jerusalem without disruption for those 400 years of silence. But in 70 AD, it's not Nero, it's another Roman leader. I can't think, I saw it the other day. Tiberius, you think Tiberius or something?
Yeah.
I don't think that's it. It's another one. Nero was involved in burning a lot of stuff. But then there was a ruler, he come through and just wiped that temple off, just destroyed it. And so there wasn't, that was the temple, and it hadn't really come back into being. Now, once Israel was disbanded, they're spread out all over the world. What year was it when it was 1948, right? After World War II, Israel becomes a nation once again. Very interesting. All right, so Israel is not going to be run off because God is the one that's going to keep them together. All right, so, all right, anyway, that's kind of where we're going to hold off right there. You got on page 37, there's the ark again, and you got a review section. And then on page 38, it's another review, but they bring in, you see these arrows? We'll take a quick look at that. 38, and then we'll stop. Yeah, okay. You see, remember we did the geography the other night, and now you see Babylonia, Eden, Jerusalem, Israel, Canaan, all those 4 areas, those whole 9 eras was that right there. See those lines? That's it. It's a small, tight area, and all these things were happening in that era, or in those 9 eras. Okay, it's like, wow, man, they just kind of kept it real close there. All right, we're going to stop there. And Tammy, you want to pray for us so we can be dismissed?